Connected by love. That's our title for this message, and we like to be connected. I mean, you think about it, sure beats the alternative, right? We don't like to be separated. We don't like to be rejected. We don't like to be ostracized or alienated. Connections feel really good to us. And it may be a connection with someone that you're close to. Maybe it's a spouse or a relative. Perhaps it's a boyfriend or girlfriend. Maybe it's a coworker. Perhaps it's a teammate or a coach who has poured into you. And at times, we even really feel the love with people that we don't even have a relationship with, but yet we feel connected with them. You say, well, I'm not certain I understand. You just lost me there, Dave. Well, let me explain it this way. I'll give you an example. My guess is that in the past few weeks, you weren't familiar with the name Sister Jean, right? And you didn't know anything about Loyola of Chicago's basketball program, but man, now you'd love to go to lunch with this lady, right? A reporter asked her several weeks ago, said, well, what did you give up for Lent? And she said, losing. And Lent officially ended on Wednesday, and so she kept her word, all right? But she connects with both fans and she connects with players. And if you're visiting with us and you're a guest here today, we want you to know the connections are really big to us here at Southeast. In fact, it's right at the heart of our mission statement, connecting people to Jesus and one another. And we believe that when those connections take place, that God does something powerful in our lives. And we realize that we were created, each one of us, in his image. And we realize and recognize that his heart beats within us and for us. And so at Easter, we celebrate being connected through Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. And we feel the love. So today, what I thought we might do is travel back in time to the very first Easter. I want you to imagine that you're there on that very first Sunday, and many people still have not gotten over what took place on Friday at this point. And the followers of Christ are having a very difficult time putting their lives back together. And if you think about it, crucifixions and sealed tombs have a way of dousing our hopes rather quickly. And the disciples are frightened, and they're terrified, and they're crushed, and they're depressed, and they're fearful. And on that morning, on that Sunday, there are a lot of different stories that are circulating. They're hearing stories that no longer are the soldiers standing guard at the tomb. And others are saying that the stone has been rolled away. And still others are saying that Jesus isn't in the tomb. So did somebody rob the grave? They don't know. Luke chapter 24 tells about two men who had followed Christ. Most likely, they weren't in the 12, but they were in the 70 followers of Christ, and they were close companions of his. And it says that these two have left Jerusalem and that they are on the road to Emmaus, which is about 7 miles away from Jerusalem. And while they're traveling, they are talking about everything that's happened, the crucifixion of Jesus, and they're just trying to make sense of all this. And we pick the story up in Luke chapter 24, verse 15. As these two men, as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. Now, that had to feel a little bit awkward to Jesus to walk up, and then here are these people having a conversation about him. You may have had that happen at some point in your life where you walked into a room where your friends were, and they had their backs to you, and they were talking about you. They just didn't know that you were there. I've had this happen several times, but most recently, some time ago, I was in a restaurant. I was sitting at a booth. I was all by myself. There was a couple seated right behind me, and so I could hear what they were saying because I wasn't talking to anyone. And the conversation turned to the topic of Southeast Christian. And so my ears perked up a little bit. And after a few minutes, one of them said, yeah, 6 flags over Jesus. And I thought, oh, never heard that one before. But I love it when people say that. I do, because I think it's a compliment. You know, I like amusement parks, and amusement parks are fun, and they're a place of joy. And being a member of Southeast is kind of like riding a roller coaster, you know? So I could let that go. But then a minute later, they started making fun of the size of our facilities and how big everything was. And I just kind of bit my tongue. But then they started making fun of the preaching. And that's when I knew I had to do something to stand up and represent Kyle. I was not going to let them talk about him like that, all right? I love my bro, okay? Look at the next verse in Luke chapter 24. Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. Now, that word kept really means to arrest, or it means to seize. In the New King James Version, it says it like this. It tells us that their eyes were restrained. So somehow God kept them from realizing or recognizing that Jesus was walking beside them, the very person that they had listened to teach plenty of times before. They'd watched him perform miracles. And I also want to point out that I think their discouragement probably kept them from seeing who Jesus was as well. Because when your eyes are downcast and you're not looking up, there's a lot of things that you miss. You see, our vision gets blurry when our hope has been buried. And that's where they were in life on that Sunday. You ever been there when it feels like you can't even see what's in front of you because of the sorrow and the anxieties and your own circumstances? The pain is just too great. And when you look, the tears keep your eyes from being able to see clearly when the world seems to bury your dreams and your purpose and your joy and your life. It's a dark place to be. Our vision gets blurry when our hope has been buried. Look at verse 17. Jesus asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" And they stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And I love Jesus here. Look at this. "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him." The Bible says their faces were downcast. They stood still. It's a posture of feeling disconnected. There was this connection that they had felt with Jesus, but now he was dead and the connection has been broken. And they just feel so discouraged. It says that they stopped walking because they were so upset and they were sad and they were hopeless. Things weren't turning out the way that they had expected. And you can think of plenty of times in your own life when your circumstances haven't turned out that way. You can think of times when you had high expectations and you thought things were just rolling along. And then all of a sudden, something just took you the opposite direction and hopeful became hopeless. I remember back when I was about to turn 50, I was really pumped up. And the reason I was pumped up was because of the simple fact that my wife loves to give good gifts. And I knew she was putting some time and effort into this when it's a significant birthday, right? And so I was very excited. I came home from work a day before my birthday. Beth was waiting for me anxiously at the door. She said, "You ready? Are you ready?" I'm like, What? She said, "Are you ready for your gift?" Well, I got excited because she was just excited. And I said, "Well, it's not till tomorrow." She said, "No, we've got an appointment and we need to be there in just a few minutes." And now I was really curious. And I said, well, tell me, what is it? And she said, "For your 50th birthday, I've made arrangements for you to go and get a back waxing." And I didn't know what a back waxing was. But she was so excited about it that I got excited about it. And so I was like, "Oh, wow, that's great." And I'm smiling and she's smiling. She said, "We got to go. We got 15 minutes to get to Shelbyville Road." I said, "Great, this is great." I just didn't know, right? But I do now. Well, we walked in this place and her eyes met with this woman there and they kind of nodded and Beth began to follow her and said, follow me. And as we walked past, there were 4 ladies and they were in these big, comfortable chairs. And they were sitting there and it was massaging their backs and their feet were in hot water. And there were 4 ladies that were down there rubbing their feet. And I'm thinking, man, have I died and gone to heaven? And they took me back to this room and they closed the door, and there was a padded table there, and this nice little woman said, take your shirt off and just lay face down there. And in my mind, this is actually what I was thinking. I'm thinking, man, I might fall asleep in the middle of this, you know? They may have to wake me up when it's time for me to leave. That's actually what I'm thinking. And I'm thinking in my mind, a back waxing, and I picture she's gonna reach back and she's gonna pull out this giant wax candle and she's gonna roll it gently over my back. And there'll be soft music playing in the background. And I'm thinking, Beth has done this so that in my stressed life, I can become stress-free. But my first hint that my thoughts were wrong was when Beth leaned over to me and said, would you like to hold my hand? But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. For the sweet little woman that I thought was a Christian began to pour burning hot lava on my back. I would have screamed, but I was convulsing so badly, no breath would come out of my mouth. And when the substance began to cool and to dry, before I could say anything, all of a sudden, this sweet woman, with the gusto of a steel worker, ripped off a field of hair follicles, and she continued to repeat this process all over my entire back. And even though I was face down the whole time, I sensed in my mind that throughout the entire procedure, the two women were smiling at each other. Several days later, someone said to me, they said, hey, what did Beth give you for your 50th? I said, a back waxing? He said, what had you done to her? You know? So I've already started praying for several years from now when I turn 60, that God just sends me a kidney stone, you know? So let's just say I didn't feel the love that day. And sometimes what seems promising becomes painful. And what starts off as exciting becomes discouraging. And what seems hopeful turns into hopeless. And that's what had happened with these followers of Jesus. I mean, everything had seemed to be going great with Jesus. And then all of a sudden, everything changed. And they just couldn't understand in their disappointment how this mighty prophet of God would be crucified. Sometimes in your life, when hopeful turns to hopeless, it's the small things. It's your bracket gets busted, your new car that you bought doesn't start. Sometimes it's not the small things, sometimes it's the big things. It's the big things, like when you're secretly looking for engagement rings and then she tells you, hey, I think we should see other people. Or it's when the nurse calls and says, hey, we have your test results, and you say, well, what are they? And the nurse says, well, really, the doctor wants to talk to you face to face, so if you could come in, and if you could come in today, this morning, that would be our preference. Or maybe it's when you hear the doorbell ring and you think it's a delivery for you, and you go only to see a police officer and a chaplain, and all of a sudden, the hope is just sucked right out of your life. And back here in Luke chapter 24, these two men are walking and talking with Jesus, and they are so disoriented and they're so hopeless. And just days before, they had to think that Jesus was about to establish some type of kingdom, some type of leadership. I mean, Jerusalem had just given him a hero's welcome. The Sunday before, they had palm branches down in front of him. They were throwing their cloaks on the ground. They were saying, Hosanna. But then the religious leaders behind the scenes turned the tide, and from Thursday night to Friday morning, everything changed. And now the sequence goes like this. The two guys continued to talk to Jesus. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. They were expecting a political coup, but Jesus was planning a spiritual revolution because he would rather his people be temporarily oppressed rather than eternally lost. Did you catch that phrase? We had hoped. Past tense. And who can't relate to that feeling? I had hoped the relationship was going somewhere. I had hoped that the tumor was shrinking. I was hoping that the judge would show leniency. I was hoping that my child would make me proud. I had hoped that the investment would pay off. I had hoped that the promotion would be mine. I had hoped that I would be back to full strength by Easter. But things don't always turn out the way we hope that they will. But God is still in control. And their conversation, Luke 24, is about to take a drastic change because Jesus is now going to enter the dialogue. And Jesus is going to speak up. Verse 25, how foolish you are, how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. What a unique verse. Jesus knows that disappointment is caused by unmet expectations, and disappointment is cured by widening your perspective. So you know what Jesus did? He did the very thing that you would have done if your child was frightened and they couldn't fall asleep some night. You tell them a story. And that's what Jesus did, only this wasn't any story. This was God's story. It was God's story of providential care for all of humanity. And the Bible tells us that Jesus began with Moses. So maybe he took them back to that moment in time where Moses was fleeing with the Israelites from Pharaoh, and they got to the point where all of a sudden they were pinned in with the Red Sea on all sides of them, and here came Pharaoh and his army after them. They said, hey, didn't they have enough graves back there in Egypt? Is that why you brought us here, Moses? But Jesus says, but God is still in control, and God has a plan, and he will intervene. Maybe Jesus took them to the Psalms, all of the stories of great despair, and yet laced throughout all of those Psalms that were written is great hope in the midst of the despair. Perhaps Jesus took them on a walk through some messianic prophecies. That's just a term that we use to talk about the predictions and the promises and the prophecies that describe the coming Messiah. It's one of the strongest proofs of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the deity of Christ are these predictions and promises. You know why? These prophecies were written hundreds and in some cases thousands of years before Christ was even born. And yet they describe the coming Messiah in graphic detail. They tell us that he would be betrayed by a friend. They tell us that he would be sold out for 30 pieces of silver. And it goes through all of these different things. Maybe he just began to walk through some of those. Perhaps he took them to Psalm chapter 22 that graphically depicts a crucifixion from the vantage point of the one who is hanging on the cross. As it talks about what he is seeing from the cross, it talks about people gambling and dividing his garments. It talks about all that he went through. What's unique is when David wrote that hundreds of years before Christ's birth, it was also decades before there had ever been a public crucifixion as a form of execution. But God, in his infinite wisdom, inspired David to write a perfect description of a crucifixion. Perhaps the very last thing that Jesus shared as he talked to them as they approached Emmaus was this passage in Isaiah chapter 53. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. And Jesus tells God's story. He goes through God's redemptive plan, and he does a walkthrough of the Old Testament to remind them, hey guys, God is still on his throne. And sometimes we need to be reminded that God is still in control, that despair is not the last word in any story that God writes. And when it comes to your dreams and your goals in your life, even though Satan might like to hold up your past and say, oh, you're done, you're finished. There's no way that God could use you in spite of the life that you've lived. And God says, hold on just a second there. Don't let Satan put a period where I have intended to place a comma. It's not over. And Jesus is begging you, and he's begging these two men on the road to Emmaus to discover that there's still another chapter. It's not finished. Because at this time, they still don't know who's there with them. They still don't know this is Jesus. Can you imagine hearing Jesus teach? The same one who spoke the universe into existence. And as they approach Emmaus, all of a sudden their faith is deepened as they listen to Jesus, and they don't know who he is. And he pretends that he has to go a little bit farther past Emmaus. And they say, oh, no, stay right here with us in Emmaus. Get some food with us. Crash with us for the night. Come inside. And these two men have benefited from the teaching and the fellowship and the conversation with Jesus so much, they want more time with him. And so Jesus goes in with them. And there's a really good takeaway for you that I want you to file in the back of your mind. Here it is. When you invite Jesus in, he will always say yes. Always. Don't ever forget that. And look at what happens when he comes in to eat with them. Verse 30 and 31. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Wow, this is the moment. They've been with him for 7 miles. They've been face to face talking with him. But in this moment, this is when all of a sudden what they see changes from what they have seen. David Copperfield's one of the most well-known, world-renowned magicians. One time he had a standing room only crowd. He had performed one of his amazing illusions. Everyone was dumbfounded. Their jaws were down on the ground and they were spellbound. And after they broke into applause and the applause subsided, a woman in the balcony hollered down to him and said, "Tell us how you did that." And Copperfield said, "Ma'am, if I told you, I'd have to kill you." And she said, "Well, then tell my husband." How'd he do that? They've been with Jesus this whole time, and now all of a sudden they realize it was him all along. How did he do that? What happened in that moment? What changed? What was different? And a lot of theologians have discussed this. Some people say, well, maybe it was because it was an act of worship. He had just been talking to them, and now he moved into worship because he prayed before he broke the bread. Other people say that it was the way that he prayed. He had such a close relationship with his heavenly Father that whenever Jesus prayed, it sounded so different than everyone else's because they were so close. Still other people say, well, I think it was the fact that he broke the bread in a distinctive fashion. And there are some people that say that different rabbis, when they would break the bread, that it would be in some unique fashion to them, their style. I don't know, I guess it could have been any one of those three. But you know what I think? I think that when Jesus broke the bread and then he gave it to them, they saw fresh wounds. They saw nail-pierced hands. Their eyes were open. They said, it's Jesus. It's Jesus. And as they look at him, I think Jesus has a big smile on his face as if to say, hey, I've been here the whole time. And you know what? He's been there the whole time for you too. Even the times when you didn't think he was there, he was there. Even in those times when your circumstances were so rough and so tough and you didn't feel like he was there, in your pain, in your doubts, he was there. And Jesus appears to these two people who are walking away from Jerusalem, away from where God was at work. But in effect, Jesus chased them down. You see, it doesn't matter if you have some doubts. It doesn't matter how many times you've walked away or the mistakes that you've made. Jesus is going to keep chasing after you because his heart beats for you. He longs to be in a relationship with you. And once these two men realize this is Jesus, instantly he vanishes and they're left sitting there looking at each other. And I love the next verse because it says, were not our hearts beating within us when he opened up the scriptures for us? They sensed that the presence of the Lord was right there with them as they walked along Emmaus. And now they have confirmation of why they felt that way. And the Bible says that immediately the two of them who have just walked 7 miles get up and they go 7 miles back to Jerusalem. You know why? They've just seen Jesus. And they want to go back and they want to tell all of the disciples, he's alive. We saw him in the flesh. We walked with him. We talked with him. He's alive. Hope will motivate you to make some passionate journeys and will lead you to some bold actions. And when the hope of Easter invades our lives, we are connected by love. And these two men, they say in Luke 24, verse 34, they say, it is true, the Lord is risen indeed. Do you believe that? Does your life reflect that? These are just two of over 500 eyewitnesses who saw in the flesh our resurrected Lord. What about the nearly 300 messianic prophecies that Jesus fulfilled? Perhaps the most compelling evidence is the number of his closest followers who died for their faith rather than denying the resurrection, choosing death rather than to admit that it was a lie. No one says, hey guys, let's keep this charade going a little bit longer, even if it costs us our life. No way. You would never die for a lie. So what you need to decide today is whether you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Last Sunday after worship, I spoke with a woman who decided that morning to commit her life to Jesus Christ. Her name is Rosie. And what a story, what a conversation we had. And oh, by the way, she's 96 years old. And as I walked away after finishing talking with her, as I walked away, her son-in-law mumbled to me under his breath, it's never too late. I said, you're right. And the next day when Rosie awakened, she told her daughter, I don't know what tomorrow will bring. 96-year-olds need to get baptized on Mondays because we're not sure we'll be here for Tuesday. And later that day, her son-in-law baptized her into Jesus Christ. And I got to be right there watching, along with about 35 family members and friends. And can I just say, it was incredible. It was a moment in time that I will never forget. And her smile, her smile is a confirmation of the hope she has of spending eternity with her resurrected Lord. Listen to me, you don't know what tomorrow will bring. You have no promise of Tuesday, let alone you have no promise of Monday. And the truth is the same for you as it is for Rosie. It's never too late. As long as you have breath in your lungs, it's not too late. Jesus will meet you at your point of pain. He will walk beside you. And maybe you feel like hope is in the past tense for you. Just remember, he is the Alpha and the Omega. He is the beginning and the end. He knows your story, and it's not over yet. So don't let discouragement or despair blur your vision. The resurrected King is right there before you and right there beside you. Is this the day for you to connect with the Christ of the cross and the Christ of the empty tomb?